morning and welcome to the Global Current. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Evan Doolittle.
In news, the Catalan secessionist movement.
The president of China speaks out about gender equality.
And growing international support for the Assad regime.
In analysis, persecution of Rohinga Muslims.
And the ramifications of President Xi Jinping's speech to the UN General Assembly.
Then, the Global Current sits down with Dr. Martin Edwards to discuss the United Nations post-2015 agenda.
Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
And now, Liam Scollins outlines the secessionist efforts of Spain's wealthy Catalan region.
Residents of Spain's northeast region, Catalonia, voted in local parliamentary elections on Sunday, September 27, 2015. According to the BBC, two pro-secessionist parties, Junts per Sí, known as Together for Yes, and Popular Unity candidacy, known as CUP, won 62 and 10 parliamentary seats respectively, out of a total of 135 seats. Last November, the Catalan government sponsored an unofficial referendum for independence, and the pro-independence faction won the popular vote. The Commission of Catalan Economy states that Catalonia is the most economically stable region in Spain and accounts for almost one-fifth of the Spanish GDP. The Catalan economy is more diversified than the rest of the country and is the main producer of high-tech devices, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and automobiles. While Spain has severely suffered from the EU debt crisis and has been plagued by high rates of unemployment, Catalonia has fared significantly better as a region. Despite broad support for independence within Catalonia, just under 50% of the popular vote, Spanish national officials remain vehemently opposed to the independence movement. After the election results were finalized, Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy stated he is willing to open a dialogue with the regional Catalan government, but he will not allow independence, as it is prohibited by the Spanish Constitution of 1978, according to The Guardian. Catalan Regional President Artur Mas confirmed that this election gives the independence movement the mandate to move forward with their agenda. In a speech recorded by NPR, he revealed an 18-month plan for an independent Catalan republic. The future of the proposed Republic of Catalan hinges upon the actions of Together for Yes and CUP in the coming months. If Together for Yes and CUP form a coalition in the regional parliament and officially declare independence from Spain, the Spanish government and EU may not be able to prevent the secession. This is Liam Scollins for the Global Current.
Yilin Du reports on President Xi Jinping hosting a women's summit during his visit to the United Nations.
President Xi Jinping of People's Republic of China spoke out at the United Nations Summit meeting for women's rights on September 27th. This summit, hosted by President Xi along with the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, was intended to help expand opportunity for women, as well as to celebrate the 20th anniversary for Women's Rights Conference in Beijing. According to USA Today, President Xi Jinping will donate $10 million to UN Women, which is a group that battles for gender equality around the world. He will also create schools and develop health-oriented projects to help women from developing countries.
In the coming 5 years, China will help other developing countries build 100 health projects for women and children, send teams of medical experts to provide services, and implement 100 happy campus projects to finance the schooling of poor girls and raise girls' school enrollment rate. We will also host 30,000 women from developing countries for training programs in China and provide 100,000 skills training opportunities in local communities of other developing countries.
A UN Women press release states that President Xi Jinping began his statement with, "We still have a long way to go in achieving gender equality. China will do more to enhance gender equality as its basic state policy, give play to women's important role as half of the sky, and support them in realizing their dreams and aspirations in both career and life." The Chinese women, through their own development, will also play a greater part of the global women's movement and make greater contributions to gender equality in the world. President Xi Jinping's visit to the United Nations and his speech also raised questions and concerns. According to CNN, Hillary Clinton posted a tweet criticizing President Xi Jinping's statement. "Xi hosting a meeting on women's rights at the UN while persecuting feminists? Shameless." Clinton also posted the hashtag #FreeThe20, which is a campaign that aims to free 20 female activists around the globe. 3 of these women are currently imprisoned in China. UN's United States Ambassador Samantha Power supports Clinton by saying, There will be some women whose critically important voices will be missing from the dialogue around the Beijing Plus 20 conference. I am talking about the voices of women political prisoners and other prisoners of concern. If you want to empower women, don't imprison them on the basis of their views or on the basis of the rights that they are fighting for. This is Elaine Du for the Global Current.
Connor Breza explains why China, Iran, and Russia are voicing support for the Assad regime in Syria.
The situation in Syria grew more complicated this week as Russia, Iran, and China decided to send troops and advisors to aid the struggling Assad government mired in Syria's civil war, according to Al Masdar News. Until recently, the war was largely between Syrian government forces and the U.S.-backed rebels. However, the large gains made by the Islamic State this year have upset the balance of power. According to a transcript posted on the Kremlin website, Russian President Vladimir Putin vocally denounced the actions of the United States in the Middle East and Africa. Putin criticized the U.S. methods of intervention in the region, citing Libya and Iraq, and asserted that these countries became power vacuums due to the U.S. government's removal of the previous legitimate governments. Coordinating with countries like China and Iran is essential to Putin's plans. These nations have already sent troops in to begin training as well as combat missions. Iranian and Russian forces have already initiated attacks on both Syrian rebels as well as the rapidly growing and encroaching Islamic State. More coordinated attacks of this nature are planned. These attacks could create more animosity between the U.S. and Russia. This is Connor Breza for the Global Current.
Christopher McNeil analyzes the persecution of Rohingya Muslims living in Myanmar and beyond.
The boat in Thai waters, carrying about 300 Rohingya men, women, and children, was found floating with a broken engine near the southern Thai island of Lipe, having been abandoned by its captain but with 2 crew on board, said the governor of Thailand's Satan province.
I was a bit scary on a boat. It was a bit hot and there's no water to drink and there's no food. I was in Malaysia, and then I went to Indonesia, Darwin, Christmas Island.
The demise of democracy in Myanmar has led to the demise of Rohingya recognition, creating an upsurge of militaristic nationalism in the government and an increase in the persecution of Rohingya Muslims. According to the BBC, the military regime passed a law in 1982 that denied the Rohingya Muslims citizenship in Myanmar, which enabled the government to deny them food, water, shelter, and basic human rights. The New York Times reports that recently there were alleged reports of rape in Indonesia when a group of males and females, ranging from 14 to 28, broke out of the refugee camp to enter Malaysia, known for a large Rohingya Muslim community. They were confronted by a group of men with masks, led them to the woods, brutally beat them, and raped 3 women, including a 14-year-old. This incident begs the question, why is no one truly helping the Rohingyas? The diplomat points out that Thailand and Indonesia were pressured internationally to provide the Rohingya Muslims sanctions until further notice. According to the United Nations Charter, Article 2, genocide is the following. Any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group's conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group.
When I went to the fields to work, I was often attacked by local gangs. They kicked me and beat me with their fists and with sticks. Also, we were discriminated against at school. They told us, "You're foreigners. This is not your country."
The law from 1982 shows the government's intent to push the Rohingyas out of Myanmar, and with the witnesses' account, Buddhist terrorism can be seen with the intent to destroy. The persecution has been going on for several decades, and even with the United Nations' existence, little has been done to help save them from the wave of genocide. The European Union is providing a plethora of assistance to the migrants from the Middle East, including shelter, food, and even employment to an extent. The United States still experiences waves of migration from South America and provides them the chance to obtain citizenship and work. So why can't the Rohingyas get anything close to that? It appears that there is a new form of isolation being formed, regional isolationism. Globalization has connected every sovereign state politically, socially, and economically, but it seems that that connection is deteriorating. Each region seems to be focused on their own agenda, and globalization has potentially overloaded the responsibilities of sovereign states. The United States have their own agenda in immigration. The European Union is trying to handle a new flow of migration. The Middle East is under the crisis of ISIS, and Africa is still trying to figure out how to economically boost themselves. Unless the Security Council, notably the Permanent Five countries, take initiative to halt the genocide, they will continue to face an uphill battle in Southeast Asia. Many states recognize the atrocities being made against the Rohingya, but have done little to fix it. It is upsetting to see that each region are too focused on their own agenda, and it is sad to see that the lessons from World War II are not truly being learned. This is Christopher McNeil for the Global Current.
Von Rogers examines what Chinese President Xi Jinping's speech to the General Assembly reveals about Chinese foreign policy.
Last week, Chinese President Xi Jinping made a speech to the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, talking about a range of topics from World War II to international security to promoting a peaceful future. Among the topics, Xi Jinping reiterated China's overall goals as outlined in the White Papers on Military Strategy published in May, saying that these same goals are that of the UN.
As ancient Chinese saying goes, the greatest ideal is to create a world truly shared by all. Peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom are the common values of mankind and the lofty goals of the United Nations. Yet, these goals are far from being achieved, and we must continue our endeavor to meet them. In today's world, all countries are interdependent and share a common future. We should renew our commitment to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, build a new type of international relations featuring win-win cooperation, and create a community of shared future for mankind.
President Xi's speech embodies Chinese foreign policy, which so far has focused on exerting soft power in economic spheres. But what is advertised and what is practiced by the Chinese government are often two different things. For example, considering the numerous territorial disputes over islands in the seas surrounding China, President Xi spoke of all countries as equals. The big, the strong, and rich should not bully the small. The principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries are inviolable. And yet, in a joint press conference at the White House, President Xi also said that
we have in-depth discussion on the situation of the Asia-Pacific, and we believe that China and the United States have extensive common interests in this region, and we should continue to deepen dialogue and cooperation on regional affairs and work together to promote active interactions and inclusive cooperation in the Asia-Pacific and work with countries in the Asia-Pacific to promote peace, stability, and prosperity in this region. China is committed to the path of peaceful development and a neighboring foreign policy characterized by good neighborliness and partnership with our neighbors. Islands in the South China Sea since ancient times are China's territory. We have the right to uphold our own territorial sovereignty and lawful and legitimate maritime rights and interests. We are committed to maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, managing differences and disputes through dialogue, and addressing disputes through negotiation, consultation, and peaceful manner, and exploring ways to achieve mutual benefit through cooperation,
which is in opposition to its insistence on peace and territorial integrity. The International Business Times reported on a list of amendments from China's foreign ministry for the UN to consider passing as resolutions. Some amendments include the prevention of war, gender equality, and cybersecurity, to which Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton responded as shameless on her Twitter feed. These inconsistencies are a reflection of the numerous internal issues China faces, particularly the disregard for rule of law, an issue President Xi has personally undertaken in his campaign against corruption. If China were to actually carry out the policies which President Xi has listed, then it would need to, for instance, instead of having bilateral negotiations with either the Philippines or Japan over the islands, it should allow multilateral negotiations, or at least a third-party negotiator, as suggested in The Diplomat. China must be careful of who it supports and how, especially since the government is so new and that it is still facing reform in the wake of anti-corruption policies. Supporting the UN with 8,000 troops was certainly good for public relations, but at the same time, China opposes any country who dares talk of Taiwan as a separate country, as written by Sigrid Winkler of the Brookings Institution. One must ask, does China use the troops and support it gives the UN as hush money to prevent Taiwan from joining or gaining support? Could that same argument be applied to other countries with which China does business? All in all, if China wishes to be considered by the world as a developed country, it must not only adhere to the principles and practice of rule of law, but also must follow through on its promises, even more so than other countries because its government is so new. This is Vaughn Rogers reporting for the Global Current.
Finally, the Global Current talks to Dr. Martin Edwards about his hopes for the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Good morning, Global Current listeners. This is Bill Golba, the associate producer of the Global Current. And joining me today is Professor Martin Edwards. Professor Edwards is the Associate Professor and Director of the Center for United Nations and Global Governance Studies at Seton Hall University. Professor Edwards, welcome.
Good morning, Bill.
So, Professor Edwards, last week the UN had a pretty big summit and laid out its plans for the next 30 years, and they called these plans the Sustainable Development Goals. So, what are the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, well, the Sustainable Development Goals are the logical successor to the Millennium Development Goals, which were promulgated in 2000 and have just wrapped up. There were 8 of them, and they largely focused on challenges in the developed world. The developing world. Let me make that brutally clear. So these were issues like poverty, hunger, health, education, and sort of basically strengthening the capacities of countries to reduce poverty, strengthening health infrastructures so that we could, make progress against malaria, building stronger education systems so that we can, so the countries can actually train the next generation of leaders. And so these new goals now have some added wrinkles. So there are 17 this time around. We're focusing on things in addition to the sort of the carryover ones, which I previously mentioned. The goals have now been expanded to include the developing world as well. So we're globalizing the goals in ways that we hadn't before. And we're also adding some different wrinkles. We're focusing now on access to energy, infrastructure, inequality, and climate change is also a goal. Goal 16 deals also with peace and rule of law. So in a sense, what the Sustainable Development Goals are just like with the MDGs, they're sort of touchstones to guide policymaking for the next 15 years, but they've been expanded both in geography, to whom they apply, and then also in substance.
And how did the UN do with the Millennium Development Goals?
Well, that's a very complicated question to answer. Okay, if you look globally, the pledge was to basically cut global poverty in half, okay, which we have done. However, if you sort of look, below the surface, things get a little more complicated. For example, the percentage of people whose income was less than $1 a day, and that's what they mean by extreme poverty, that was meant globally. It wasn't meant in sub-Saharan Africa. Child mortality was cut considerably, and that target wasn't met, but that target was incredibly ambitious. That was a 2/3 cut, and we're at more than 50% globally. So those are just sort of 2 examples. We pushed forward on a number of fronts, and in a sense, I think the focus of whether or not the goals are met sort of overlooks really their point, right? What they're trying to do is orient policymakers and sort of call attention to things that governments might not care about. And so in a sense that the issue about do they make a difference is broader than the targets themselves. It focuses on whether or not governments begin to sort of develop national policy strategies for meeting the goals. And that's happened all over the world.
And it will probably continue to happen with the SDGs. And
absolutely.
That's probably a reason why there were so many world leaders here in the last week. I know that many folks in our listening area probably had to deal with some traffic tie-ups because of the UN summit going on. Why was it important for all the world leaders to be here for the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, I think it calls attention to the fact that the goals were not handed down by the UN Secretariat. They were developed in a very inclusive process that involved the countries of the world saying, hey, what should our priorities be? It also involves civil society across the globe saying, what should our policies be? So, they're coming to New York to sort of underscore the seriousness of this endeavor as we move forward.
And One of the leaders that came to spoke at the event was Pope Francis. And I know here at Seton Hall we had a viewing party to watch the Pope's speech, and we had some discussion on its implications. But for the wider audience, why was the Pope even at this event?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, sometimes people were sort of confused, and they thought of him as if he was wearing just one hat as a religious leader. But he is also a head of state. And his context in which he was speaking, sort of leading off the Sustainable Development Summit, was as a head of state. The Pope has been sort of active in, stressing the importance of engagement on extreme poverty, engagement on inequality, and certainly with the encyclical that came out over the summer, focusing our attention on climate. So it reflects not only his role as head of state, but also the fact that the Vatican's agenda globally and the UN's agenda overlap with respect to the SDGs.
Now, you mentioned that the Church's agenda and the SDGs overlap in a lot of senses. Is there any place where the SDGs might be at odds with developments happening in the wider world?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say at odds. Countries, even when they spoke during the summit, and also when they spoke in justifying their approval to send the document to the General Assembly for approval, expressed reservations. That's sort of common under international law. And some of the Vatican's concerns and some of the concerns expressed by other countries are perhaps not surprising. There is a bit of a global pushback about, not necessarily a strong one, but certainly from the standpoint of the leaders that were expressing it, a concentrated one, about the role of women and about correcting any perception that when we say the goals are designed to leave no one behind, that we're talking about specific groups and not other specific groups that might be implied. Countries view the groups that they focus on when they hear the phrase "no one left behind" differently. And so there are some countries in the world that, that while there's a big push in the goals to focus on women, some countries sought to minimize that. Many of the leaders, while this is not a goal, expressed a desire for an SDG dealing with the rights and responsibilities for the LGBT community. And some leaders were very, very explicit that they did not believe that the LGBT community should have any rights implied to them under the goals. So that's, in a sense, the pushback is about clarification, about these goals apply to us. That is a legitimate device in international law. It doesn't mean that countries are going to refuse to adopt them. It's just they've always been encouraged to shape the goals in vis-a-vis national circumstances. Sometimes that's happening in ways that an enlightened Western audience might not find all that nice.
Right, but one has to bear in mind that the UN represents the whole world and not just the West and the United States.
Or my view of this in the New Jersey suburbs. Absolutely.
So, as you've mentioned, the SDGs have not been without some degree of criticism, if not in their content or aims, then in their implementation. I know that we spoke at the viewing party with Hugh Duncan, the Sharkey Distinguished Visiting Scholar at Seton Hall, who had worked at the UN, at the U.S. mission to the UN for 26 years, and he compared the SDGs to the UN trying to install software onto a typewriter, that it's wonderful in theory, but that the UN infrastructure as a whole needs to change before the spirit of the SDGs can translate into observable results. Do you see anything to that?
What I like about the SDGs is their ambition. And what I admire about them is their ambition. What we are trying to do with Post-2030 is try to think about framing global politics differently. I think that the installing software on a typewriter comment, I think there is a certain amount of truth to that, because the goals are all about empowering civil society. And in a very real sense, that's something that's a difficult line for the UN to walk, because after all, civil society has presence in the UN, but they don't have true representation in the same way that states do. But it is a natural thing for the UN to turn to civil society as a force multiplier to push these goals. So, to me, I think that the challenge is that civil society sought many of these goals, and now the responsibility falls to civil society to put pressure on governments to ensure that they commit more fully to the goals. So that, to me, I think is the exciting part, is that this is a story in, kind of global politics that has yet to be written, and that is potentially transformative.
And you mentioned that civil society will be playing an ever larger role moving forward in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Does part of that also involve financing?
Yeah, I think the natural question I always get asked is, okay, these are cool goals. How are we going to pay for them? And quite obviously, that's a sensible question. I think the controversy about the goals has been the issue of who's putting the bill. There was a conference over the summer in Addis. It was called the Financing for Development Summit. And many developing countries were hoping for more money from the developed world. They were hoping that all of the developed countries would make a strong commitment to provide foreign aid in excess of 0.7% of their gross national incomes. That hasn't happened yet. So that does raise the question, well, what else is there? There was a strong push in the Addis document for countries to take responsibility for themselves by creating tax systems that are more sensible, more rational, and more revenue generating. And to me, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can't get ownership without having your own resources in the game. And the fact that many countries, many developing countries, don't have things like income tax systems. Right? If you're relying on tariffs, sales taxes as a source of revenue, then there's a whole lot of state capacity that you are not building because there's no money to support it. So I think that what we're trying to do is, and this again speaks to the ambitiousness of the agenda, is strengthen the capacity of states to provide public goods for their own citizens. And obviously, developing sensible tax systems is an important part of that.
And that's certainly a worthwhile goal for us to be having as a human race. So with the SDG summit out of the way, what else is coming up next on the agenda for the UN?
Well, with all of the leaders in town, there was a meeting about peacekeeping support in which countries made additional commitments to peacekeeping. That was chaired by President Obama a couple of days ago. The big action is going to start to move out of New York and over to Paris for the climate summit. And of course, the question is, will the energy and excitement that we have about the goals in New York translate to developing a climate agreement that makes everybody happy in Paris? All you have to do is hear any of the delegates from developing countries speak. The folks from the Maldives have been incredibly vocal about this, and they've been incredibly vocal about this for one reason. The sea level rise, will certainly affect the U.S. It will certainly affect Florida. Right? It will certainly affect New Orleans. It will certainly affect New York. But it will most undeniably affect the Maldives. When these policymakers have to worry about our country might not exist in 100 years. That's the biggest incentive to call for action you can possibly imagine.
And with that call for action, I think we're just about out of time. So
on that happy note.
So, Professor Edwards, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Once again, that was Dr. Martin Edwards, Associate Professor and Director of the Center for United Nations and Global Governance Studies at the Seton Hall School of Diplomacy and International Relations. I'm Bill Golba. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm Evan Doolittle.
And I'm Karina Taylor.
We'll see you next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Alicia Sharapali, and associate producer is Bill Golda. The show's technical producer is Evan Doolittle. Our news editor is John Chateau, and our analysis editor is Blythe Brady. The Global Current theme song is Acid Jazz by Kelly McLeod. You've been listening to The Global Current on WSOU 89.5 FM, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.